Corinthians 15, verses 40 and 41. And there are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but the glory of the heavenly is truly different, and that of the earthly different. One glory of the sun, and another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars, for star differs from star in glory. Shalom, shalom, and thank you for joining me today in part 2 of this study series titled The Keys to the Creation Calendar. The key of David is the understanding of the scriptures, which hold the key that opens the knowledge of heaven. In part 1, we located many key verses to unlocking the knowledge of the greater luminary, the sun. In part 2, we will be exploring the biblical scriptures in order to understand our Creator's intended purpose in his time clock for the lesser light, the moon. Now, I was hoping to include the stars in this part 2, but due to the length and time constraints, I'm going to have to make the stars part 3. And I'm surprised that I even got part 2 out, as Ha-Satan has done everything he can to put stumbling blocks in my way this last couple of weeks. Every time I've sat down to try to work on this study, something came up out of the ordinary. So that tells me that the spirits really don't want this message out there. So all I can say is Baruch Hashem, I must be doing something right. The key to returning to the Creator's appointed set times has indeed been well hidden. But from the very beginning of the written word, Yahuwah gives us clues to the key which opens the garden gate. Kings David and Solomon both write about the heavenly lights, and it is through these writings and those of the prophets in which the key that opens heaven is found. Psalms 89, 35 through 37. Once I have sworn my holiness, I will not lie to David. His seed shall be forever, and his throne as the sun before me. Like the moon, it shall be forever, and a faithful witness in the sky. The key of David uses symbolism in chorus to reveal and conceal the knowledge of Yahuwah. It is the key to understanding the scriptural inclusion of one event and the exclusion for another. For what has been included forms the visible shadow of what cannot be seen. It prevents understanding the mysteries of our Eloah before the end of the age, which we are quickly approaching. But as I have spoken before, when I first started to try to live and learn Torah many years ago, I was taught in the lunar persuasion. And for about 10 years, I followed the lunar Sabbath. Then it was about 2012 when a sister in Yahuwah came to stay with us and brought the book of Enoch back to our attention. That is when our walk took a right turn. Now, the reason I mention this is because I just think it is important to understand the history of the intimate relationship that I had with the moon. 10 years of citing the moon's monthly course. I was all in. That was my life. It revolved around the Sabbaths. Yahuwah had blessed me with my own company. I had a portable toilet and septic company for a lot of years. And I could control the scheduling, and we did close our doors for the lunar Sabbath each month. Our handful of employees just knew that that was their day off. Whether they followed our Sabbath or not, that was the day we closed our doors. Because I was all in. I was hot to know the truth about the Sabbath. So then why did I leave the lunar Sabbath, you ask? Now, the reckoning of the Sabbath day is done using various methods, such as calculating the lunar conjunction or by observing the crescent moon. We did it by observation. The new moon day is then followed by 4 weeks that consist of 6 working days and a Sabbath. This results in the Sabbaths always falling on the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th of the month. This then placed all 3 of the main feast days, the Hagag, the pilgrim feasts, on the weekly Sabbath. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, Shavuot, and the first day of Sukkot are all on the 15th day of their respective months. This we called a high Sabbath. A high Sabbath is one where a weekly Sabbath and the feast day lands on the same day. Now, this only happens when we use the moon to set the feasts. Now, the Jews have issues with this too, because they too use the moon to set their feasts. Now, although the overlapping of the feast days and their Shabbat would be less frequent, because they use Saturday as the Shabbat and not a lunar reckoning. But because the Gregorian Saturday does wander through the counted days, sometimes it aligns with their feast day counts. Consequently, this is where I had my dilemma with the lunar Sabbath. Now, setting the months by the new moon would then give us a full moon Sabbath on Pesach, on Passover. Now, some of you might be thinking, there's supposed to be a full moon on Pesach. But here is where my anguish came from. Let's go to Mark 16, verses 1 and 2. And the Sabbath passing, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome brought spices so that coming they may anoint him. And very early on the first of the week, the sun having risen, they came upon the tomb. Now Matthew 12:40, and it says, and even as Jonah was in the belly of the huge fish 3 days and 3 nights, so shall the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. Okay, we all pretty much know this, right? So then, if the weekly Shabbat, the lunar reckoning of the weekly Shabbat, was on the Passover, unleavened bread, holy convocation day, and via scripture, the Messiah rose 3 days later, if I do my math right, the next weekly Sabbath would be in 6 days, not 3. When the women came to the tomb on the first day of the week, finding the Messiah gone, a Sabbath had just passed, right? That's what the verses tell us. The Sabbath was passed, they had rested, and came to the tomb. As soon as they could leave their homes, it was becoming dawn, the Sabbath was passing, they're going to the tomb. So that's the question I have to raise. What Sabbath did the Messiah rise on? Boy, I had a lot of learning to do. The lunar Sabbath just could not hold up against the scripture test here. And since Passover represents the bride's selection, I didn't want to be attending on the wrong day. I mean, can you imagine showing up for your own engagement party a day too late? Genesis 1 is where Yahuwah describes for us the setting of his timepiece in the heavens during the creation week. We learn that there is a greater luminary to rule over the day and two lesser luminaries which rule over the night. Genesis 1:14. And Elohim said, let luminaries be in the expanse of the heavens to divide between the day and the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. Now Yahuwah explains that he has given to us the lights in the heaven as signs to be used as markers in the counting of his moedim, his appointments, which are, as he just listed, his festal seasons, his Sabbath days, and his sabbatical and jubilee years. Now, the festal seasons not only comprise of what we think of as the feast days, like Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, but also include the Shabbat, sabbatical, and jubilee years as well. Leviticus 23, verses 2 and 3. Speak to the sons of Israel, and you shall say to them, the appointed feasts of Yahuwah, which you shall proclaim, holy gatherings, shall be these. These are my appointed seasons. Verse 3, work is to be done 6 days, and in the 7th day shall be a Sabbath of rest, a holy gathering. You shall do no work. It is a Sabbath to Yahuwah in all your dwellings. So right here, Yahuwah is plainly telling us that his weekly Sabbaths are an appointed season. And as I said in part 1, the Sabbath is the calendar anchor, as all time revolves around it. Simply put, our Creator set the lights in heaven to be markers for the Sabbaths of days and for the Sabbaths of years. In part 1, we established that the greater luminary was the light that pointed to the Sabbath of days. The sun was given an eternal sign of the due east rising on the 4th day of creation. This key was fixed so that we would never lose the 7th day Sabbath of creation. Could we then reason that if the greater luminary guides us to the Sabbaths of days, then one or both of the lesser luminaries must guide us to the Sabbaths of years? Note also that nowhere in Genesis 1:14 are we told that the luminaries are for the months, only for feasts, Sabbaths, and jubilees. Now, books like Jubilees and Enoch, along with historical writings like the Dead Sea Scrolls, gives us insight to our Creator's calendar by adding support and color to the structure of the biblical scriptures. But for today, we will set those books aside and see if we can discover the keys to understanding the duties of the lesser lights in Scripture alone. Genesis 1:16, and Elohim made 2 greater luminaries, the great luminary to rule the day, and the small luminary and the stars to rule the night. Psalm 136, verse 9, the moon and the stars to rule by night, for his mercy endures forever. Recorded on the 4th day of creation is the law for the lesser luminaries to rule, that is, to govern over the night. Now, although the moon does wander into the realm of the sun on a regular basis, she still has her jurisdiction over the night. Confirmed by the Psalms of King David, this Maybe a small key, but a key nonetheless. Therefore, let's keep investigating. Psalms 8:3. For I shall see the heavens, the works of your fingers, the moon and stars which you ordained. Now, this word ordained means to set up, establish, fix, appoint, render, faithfulness, firm, be fixed, ordain, order, perfect, prepare, be stable, and establish. Thus, the moon was ordained to be stable in order to establish a fixed appointment. Let's keep this in mind as we continue, for even the lesser lights, the moon and the stars, show the glory and power of the Father of lights. Yahuwah not only made them, but ordained them, and the ordinance of heaven can never be altered. They were not to be worshipped, but to be used by all the nations as tools for his timekeeping. Deuteronomy 4:19. Beholding the sun and the moon and the stars and all the cosmos of the heaven wandering. All the lights wandering through the heaven, which Yahuwah your Eloah bestowed them to all the nations underneath the heaven. When we consider of what great use the heavens are to men on earth, that they lead us back to time with our Father, and how the lights of heaven are given unto all nations, we may well ask, Yahuwah, what is man to you, that you should determine the ordinances of heaven with an eye towards him and to his benefit? Baruch Hashem. As with all mysteries, sometimes we have to dig deep to find the key that unlocks the door. Let's take a look at 3 different versions of Jeremiah 31:35 so that we can glean some understanding from this verse about the lesser light of heaven. So Jeremiah 31 verse 35, I'm going to start with the Apostolic Bible Polyglot version. And it says, Thus said Yahuwah, the one appointing the sun for light of day, moon and stars for light of the night. Yahuwah Almighty is his name. So now let's look at the literal version. And it says, So says Yahuwah, who gives the sun for a light by day, the laws of the moon and the stars for a light by night. Yahuwah of hosts is his name. And then finally, let's take a look at the Geneva 1587 Bible. And it says, Thus saith Yahuwah, which giveth the sun for a light to the day, and the courses of the moon, and the stars for a light to the night. His name is Yahuwah of hosts. Now, given that the written word must strictly align with the physical world and vice versa, we can then logically reason that our Creator gave laws pertaining to the courses of the moon. Would seem reasonable. We know that the sun, like a strong man, has a course it runs each year, which is beautifully illustrated in Psalms 19. Therefore, it would seem reasonable that the moon, too, would have a course that is used to track the Creator's days. Thus, before we can determine how the timekeeping duties of the moon are to be used, we need to have some understanding as to how the moon works. Now, the moon is quite a complex creature, and perhaps that is one of the reasons why it is associated with the feminine. Just saying. Because of the intricate dance that the moon does in the heavens, she has many courses in which we can divide days. Courses and cycles that were understood and used by ancient timekeepers. recorded as far back as the Sumerians, Babylonians, and ancient Egyptians, all places where the Hebrews hung out. Now, when we think of the moon, we typically think it can keep track of the weeks through its phases, and thus the months. In common usage, the 4 major phases of the moon are the new moon, the first quarter, the full moon, and the last quarter. The 4 minor phases are waxing crescent, waxing gibbous, waning gibbous, and waning crescent. A lunar month is the time between successive reoccurrences of the same phase. So as an example, from new moon to new moon, that would be a lunar month. Due to the eccentricity of the moon's orbit, this duration is not perfectly consistent, but averages about 29.5 days. Thus, it's sometimes longer and sometimes shorter. Now, on average, the intermediate phases last 1/4 of a synodic month, 1/4 of a lunar phase month, or 7.38 days, but varies plus or minus 11% due to lunar apogee or perigee. In other words, how far or how close the moon is respectively will determine on how long her phases are. Now, the duration from full moon to new moon or from new moon to full moon varies. Sometimes it's 13 days and it can be 15 days, 14 days. So it varies approximately from 13 days, 22.5 hours to about 15 days and 14.5 hours. So month to month, it varies. We can see then that the synodic courses or phases of the moon day to day and month to month isn't exactly 7 days nor exactly 30. For this reason, the lunar synodic year ends 10 to 11 days earlier than the solar year. Clearly, the moon is too unstable in the physical realm to keep track of our Father's perfect timing of a week or a month. For he is not an author of disarray. He never said his weeks are approximate. He never says his months are approximate. So thus, the moon is too unstable in these phases to track his perfect week, to track his perfect timing in the month, because he is not an author of disarray. Now, Daniel and the book of Revelation alludes to the prophetic or apocalyptic year, as seen in the use of the phrase time, times, and half a time, which then we can equate to 1,260 days or 42 months, as referenced in these scriptures. These references represent a period of 1,260 days based on the 360-day year multiplied by the 3.5. Now, if we divide the 1,260 by 42 months, then we will also get a 30-day month, as 12 months of 30 days equals 360 days in a year. So this is the prophetic year that we find in the book of Daniel and the book of Revelations. Now, the solar year, on the other hand, is 365.25 days. And as we just learned, 10 to 11 days longer than the lunar synodic year. Then just to mention, the book of Jubilees and Enoch tells us that the creation year is 364 days long, as confirmed in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But regardless, this makes the moon's synodic system incompatible with the solar cycles, and thus cannot be the tool to divide the weeks or months within these systems. It's like the proverbial square peg in a round hole and then hoping it'll turn out triangular. The systems have to be compatible in order for them to divide each other. This is where those, trust me, I know, of the lunar persuasion will argue that Psalms 81 proves that the new moon begins a biblical month. Trust me, I used this argument a lot back in my day. So let's break it down in order to locate the key that unlocks this door. Psalms 81 verse 3. We're going to start with the King James Version. It says, blow up the trumpet in the new moon in the time appointed on our solemn feast day. Okay, so we're supposed to blow the trumpet in the new moon in the time appointed on our solemn feast day. So this is all talking about a singular day in this verse. A new moon, an appointed time, a single day, feast day. Now, the Apostolic Bible Polyglot says, trump during the new moon a trumpet on the well-marked day of your holiday. Okay? Again, we're supposed to trump the trumpet on the well-marked day of a holiday, a singular holiday. Then we'll look at the ESV. It says, blow the trumpet at the new moon, at the full moon on our feast days. Okay, so this is a little confusing because in this translation, we're told that there's 2 days that we blow the trumpet. That's our feast day. A new moon and a full moon. That seems a little confusing there. So let's break it down. First, we start with blow the trumpet. Now, the word used here is shofar, and it means a ram's horn. So they're not using the silver trumpets, but they're using the ram's horn. The very first time we see a shofar being mentioned is at Mount Sinai, and it was referred to as the voice of Eloah, which made the whole camp tremble. First time my puppy dog heard me blow the shofar, that got her trembling too. She's like, whoa, what is that? The shofar was also used to wage war, to sound alarms for the camp, to convene assemblies, to announce the new month and the Jubilee year, to herald messages, and to coronate kings. It was also used as an instrument of praise. Then the next part of this psalm tells us exactly what it is being sounded for on the new moon. So the trumpet is being sounded on the day of the new month. The Hebrew translation, Rosh Chodesh, literally means the head of the month. This is the phrase used for every first day of every month in the Hebrew calendar. This Hebrew phrase, Rosh Chodesh, has been incorrectly translated as new moon in many modern-day Bible versions. Now, historical writings gives us clues as to when and why this mistranslation happened at the time when the calendar got changed in the Second Temple period. Rosh, meaning head, whether literally or figuratively in many applications of place, time, rank, etc. The beginning, captain, chief, first, forefront, lead, principal, ruler, top. So that's Rosh. And then the word Kadesh means new month and comes from the word Kadash, a primitive root meaning to be new, causatively to rebuild, renew, repair. Now, the Hebrew word for moon is yareach, and the phrase head of the month is never written as head of the moon or Rosh Yerah or Rosh Yareach. Now, if it were the moon that set the months originally, the Hebrew would read Rosh Yerach, head of the moon, or Kadash Yurok, new moon. Neither of these phrases are found within the scriptures in this kind of application. The word Kadesh is actually used over 256 times in the Tanakh, always referring to a solar month and not a lunar or moon of any type. Exodus 12:2. This month, this Kadesh, is to you the beginning of the months, the beginning of the Kodeshim. It is to you the first among the Kodeshim of the year, of the Shana. This is the very first commandment given to the nations as a whole, an indication that the concept of the Rosh Chodesh is very meaningful. Now, in part 1 of this series, we found the key that opened the head of the year, or the head of the months, the Rosh Kodeshim, lay on the shoulders of the Son of Righteousness. It is the Son that gives us the key to the head of the months. Exodus 40, verse 2, you shall set up the tabernacle of the tent of the congregation on the first day of the first month, on the Rosh Kodeshim, the head of the months. Now, towards the east, they were commanded to face the tabernacle on the day the sun rose due east in the heavens. Moreover, 1,000 years later in Israel, during the period of the Syrian Greek persecution, the Rosh Chodesh was one of only 3 commandments whose observance the oppressors prohibited. The other 2 forbidden commandments were the Shabbat and circumcision. That the Rosh Chodesh was on a plane with those central observances is an ample indication of its significance. It is a day observed unto itself. And I plan on having a new updated study on this real soon on the Rosh Chodesh. But we can see it is so important to understand how to reckon the months, because they are a set-aside day. Thus, so far, we have been instructed to blow the shofar at the head of the month. So let's continue with Psalms 81:3. And it says, in the time appointed. The word used here is the Hebrew kaseh, meaning fullness. It's festival appointed time, but sometimes implied as full moon. Thus, the confusion in the translations. From the root word kasah, meaning properly to plump, fill up, to be covered, clad, conceal, cover for protection, to cover over, spread over, hide. So let's keep this in mind as we continue. On our solemn feast day, this Hebrew word is Hag, meaning a festival, a solemn feast day, sacrifice, solemnity. This is any feast day, unlike the word Hagag, which points to the 3 pilgrim feasts, where we are to meet with Eloah at his designated place. And taking a look at the meaning from the word origin and history for the word solemn, it says, it is performed with due religious ceremony or reverence, sacred, devoted to religious observances, also a vow, etc. So we now have the key to understanding what King David is saying to us in this verse. Blow the shofar in observance of the Rosh Chodesh, of the new month, as its appointed time has reached its fullness. It's arrived. This important festival that covers over and protects. Wow. The Rosh Chodesh is a time of covering and protection. It is looked upon as a type of atonement day, so that we can enter each new month with blessings from our Eloah. Despite the Rosh Chodesh being such an important day each month, it seems to be one of the least understood and observed of all of Yahweh's divisions of days. And as I said, I got a new study coming in on that. So then the question needs to be asked, if the moon is too unreliable to govern over the weeks and months, where do we find a stable course for the moon in Yahweh's timekeeping? Because he told us that the sun, moon, and stars are to be used for that purpose. So to answer that question, let's take a look for another key from David to see if we can discover more about the duty of the lesser light, the moon. We're going to go to Psalms 104, starting with verse 19. He appointed the moon, the Uraeach, for seasons. The sun knows it's going down. You make darkness in its night, in which all the beasts of the forest creep forth. The young lions roar after their prey and seek their food from Eloah. On the surface, Psalms 104:19, when read in context, it speaks of the Moedim, or the season of the night. The moon signals the nocturnal beasts in the forest to look for prey in the appointed moed of night, of darkness. This is confirmed in Genesis 1:16, where it says the small luminary and the stars to rule the night. This is just confirmation. And we can see as well in verse 22, where the moedim, the appointed time of the light of the day, is regulated by the sun, signaling the nocturnal animals to return to their dens. Psalms 104:22, the sun rises and they are gathered and go to their dens to lie down. But there again, recall, the key of David uses symbolism to reveal and conceal the knowledge of the heavens. The luminaries are given as signs to be used for markers in the counting of Yahweh's Moedim. We've already established that. His festal seasons, Sabbath days, sabbatical and jubilee years, right? Let's then peel back the surface understanding of Psalms 104:19 and dig deeper into this word seasons to see if we can find a key. Now, the Hebrew word, as we've been talking about, is moed or moedim, which means, of course, an appointed set time for the feasts. In other words, the festal seasons. Now, in the LXX, the word used is kairos, meaning an occasion, set or proper time, season, time. And we're told to compare G 5550. So let's go to G 5550. And that word is chronos. And that means a space of time which designates a fixed or special occasion or interval, years old, season. Okay, so the first thing I notice within this definition is that the designation is fixed. Thus, when applying a fixed designation to the moon, we must take into consideration her more stable and accurate courses. Secondly, the designation is a special occasion. And finally, we can see that there is no called out designation for weeks or months, as there is for years. And we already know from part 1 that the sun is designated to mark the annual Sabbaths or the Sabbaths of days. Therefore, is this a key that the moon is designated to mark the Sabbaths of years, the sabbatical and jubilees? Hence, before we go any further, let's take a moment to look at the different ways the moon can be used to more accurately measure time in the physical, other than just ruling the night, which she doesn't even do that full time, to see if there are any of these courses that align with any scriptural timetables given to us by our Creator. Now, some of the terms I'm going to discuss may seem unfamiliar and a bit confusing at first. Or maybe it was just me. And I think it's because many of us have become unfamiliar with the heavens, and so we haven't familiarized ourselves with the different courses of the moon. Nevertheless, the priests and ancient timekeepers were quite acquainted with these lunar cycles and used them in tracking the division of days as ordained by Yahuwah. So first we have the lunar synodic month of 29.53 days. And this is what we've been talking about so far. The time it takes for the moon to return to the same lunar phase, like new moon to new moon. Now, the lunar sidereal month is 27 and a pinch days long, 0.32, and is the period for the moon to return to the same position compared to the distant stars. So when it gets back in front of the same stars as it was in previously, that is a sidereal month. Now, sidereal is always related to the stars. So when you hear the word sidereal, that is a relation to the stars. So the difference between the synodic and the sidereal lengths, one is 29 days, one is 27 days, is due to the orbital movement of the Earth-Moon system around the sun. So the moon is doing her dance around the Earth in these different cycles as the Earth and the moon together circle the sun. Because of these different circles or wheels of time, this creates the different wheels or courses of time for the moon. Okay? That's why she has so many different courses, because she's doing this intricate dance in the heavens. And because of the difference between the synodic and sidereal courses, we can then define the stations of the moon against the zodiac Mazzaroth stars. By averaging these two systems, the 29 plus 27 which equals 56. We divide that by 2 because we're averaging 2 things, equals 28. And now we're going to times that by 13, which gives us 364-day year, where the moon aligns with the stars and sun once again. This also equals the number of days we are told in Jubilees and Enoch, that is the length of the creation year. Okay, so why did I multiply it by 13? Because the moon orbits the earth 13 times a year. Yet, because of this cosmic dance between the earth and the sun, the moon only passes between the earth and the sun 12 times a year. This is why we use the number 13 in this math, because the moon orbits the earth 13 times. And this is why sometimes there has to be a 13th month in the lunar reckoning. Now, the Metonic cycle is another course of the moon. It is a period of 19 years in which there are 235 lunations, or 235 synodic months, after which the moon's phases reoccur on the same days of the solar year. So in other words, a new moon would realign with the vernal equinox every 19 years. That's where the sun and moon would come back together. 19 years. We discovered the use of this Metonic cycle for tracking the Jubilees by the priests in the Dead Sea Scroll 4Q319. In this scroll, they used 6 out of the 24 families to track the third-year tithe, sabbatical, and Jubilee years, calling out 2 key families in a cipher of information. These are the families of Gamuel and Shechaniah. Now, while plotting out this scroll, I discovered that the family of Shechaniah fell on the leap year every 12th year. So what does the scripture tell us about Shechaniah's job? So let's go to 2 Chronicles chapter 31, starting with verse 11. And Hezekiah ordered them to build rooms in the house of Yahuwah, and they prepared. And they brought in the heave offering, the tithes, and the holy things faithfully. And by the hand of Eden, and Mijamin, and Jeshua, and Shemaiah, and Amariah, and Shechaniah, in the cities of the priests, acted faithfully to give to their brothers by division, as to the great, so to the small, outside of the genealogy of the males from 3 years and up, to all entering into the house of Yahuwah for a reckoning of days in its day, for the ministration of daily rotation of their arrangement. Subsequently, we not only find in the Dead Sea Scrolls the family of Shechaniah is an important marker in the tracking of the third-year tithe, but it was his job, according to Scripture, to distribute the goods that were purchased with that tithe to feed the poor, widows, and orphans. As to the great, so to the small. I also thought it was kind of interesting. In verse 15, the Mijamin is also one of those families in the Dead Sea Scrolls that break down the tithe, third-year tithe, sabbatical, and jubilee. So Mijamin is also a family that's in that scroll. So Psalms 19, written by King David, declares that the heavens and everything else humans see is a living testament to the existence, glory, and power of our Eloah. The Apostle Paul reiterates this fact in Romans 1:19 when he writes, "Because that which may be known of Eloah is manifest among them, for Eloah has manifested it to them." In order for the lunar cycle to count out anything in the solar cycle, we must look to where the two cycles are compatible. They have to walk together. This would be where they best realign with each other in cycles of 3 years, 8 years, 11 years, 19 years, 353 years, 1,078 years, and 1,431 years, increasing with accuracy the farther out we go in the cycles. Notice the big gap between 19 and the next better cycle of 353 years. The 353-year period equals to 18 sets of 19 years plus 1 of 11. Now, this alignment is so accurate that it has a total error of only 0.022 days and could be used throughout history without accumulating an error of even 1 day. So we can see there are cycles where the moon and the sun can come back together. So in the 3-year cycle, the moon will appear against the same stars, but in a different phase. Now, the interesting thing about the moon and this 3-year cycle is that there are 3 cycles of 3 that are intertwined. The moon's age advances by 3 days every 3 years. Not because it advances a day each year, for each year is a part of its own 3-year cycle. Rather, this 3-year age advancement happens only in the 3rd year cycle. Every 3 years, the moon's cycle progressed 3 days more than the previous 3rd year, except on the leap years, when the lunar phase advanced 4 days at the vernal equinox. Okay, this is being measured from the vernal equinox, these ages of the moon phases, new moon, 1 day old, 2 day old, 3 day old. So I'm talking about the age of the moon as it gets bigger or smaller in its phases. The age changes every day, right? So the moon every 3 years advanced 3 days. So it starts out as a new moon, and then in 3 years it'll be 3 days old. The age progressed 3 days more than the previous 3rd year. And like I say, except on the leap years when it advances 4 days. At that same equinox, where we're marking the 4th year, we will have a nighttime vernal equinox on the 19th of March. Typically, the equinoxes land on March 20th. So every 4th year, the equinox does appear a day earlier. Well, I wouldn't say a day earlier, just hours earlier, still into the 19th at night. It'll always be a nighttime equinox that we won't even be able to see until the next day. So, talk a lot about that when we're reckoning, in our studies about reckoning the new year. So that's how all that works when we're timing things around the equinox. We're looking for that straight line shadow, the due east rising of the sun, and what phase the moon is in is going to tell us several things. And these are the things that the priests understood. Looking at the chart, we can see 3-year cycles, or wheel in a wheel in a wheel. In my study titled The Moon in the Priestly Order, I broke down 4Q319 line by line in order for us to understand how the priests were tracking the moon in the Jubilees. I had discovered that while plotting out those 6 families as per the scroll, that the family of Shechaniah always fell on the 12th leap. And of course, a lot of tracking of time can easily happen with that information. 12 years is an easy number to work with to track time. But for this study, since we are only using current biblical scripture, instead of looking at what the DSS says, what the Dead Sea Scroll says, I aligned the counting of the days with all the priestly families, as listed in First Chronicles, because there's nowhere in the scripture that tells us of this division of the 6 families. So I took all the families that are listed in First Chronicles 24, and I put them in the chart that I had originally had for just the 6 families. And lo and behold, the families of Shechaniah and Gamul, remember Shechaniah and Gamul are the 2 keys to the cipher, they only land on the leap years. I couldn't believe it. I mean, I wasn't surprised about Shechaniah, but Gamul, I was really surprised with. And they are always 12 years apart from each other. Now, I'm not saying that they're the only ones that land on leaps, because we have other families that land on leap years. But Shechaniah and Gamul only land on leap years. They don't land on any other of the other years, which I was surprised. They just land on the leap years as we go through the priestly cycle courses of the whole 24 course. It was amazing to me. I know, I'm easily amazed, but I just really didn't expect to see that with the family of Gamul. And so much can be done with this. And we'll also talk in part 3 about how this 12-year count can also work with the stars. So that will be something we'll discuss in part 3 on how this continual counting can also not only count out things for the sun and the moon, but with the stars as well. So these leaps, along with 3 different courses of the moon, that would be the synodic course, which we've been discussing, about the phases, the draconic system, the draconic lunar system, and the anomalistic lunar system. These 3 courses of the moon coincide with what is called a Saros cycle. Okay, there's a lot to these courses. Now, the Saros is the ruler of the eclipses. Now, I was going to go deeper into all these courses and how they all worked and the moon and the Saros, but for the sake of time, I really just want to encourage you to do more research on your own on this. And I'm going to share a video that I don't know who this man is and I have no affiliation with him, but I found his video very educational to help us understand how some of these courses work and how they work in unison with each other, and how ancient timekeepers use them to track things like the solar and lunar eclipses. So it's a fascinating research, but for the sake of time in this particular study, I'm not going to go into all of those cycles, because we're going to just concentrate here today on those cycles that the priest could use in timing Yahuwah's feasts and festivals. Okay, so now we're going to look back at the compatible lunar and solar cycles, those that match the important biblical cycles that we are instructed to count and observe. So this brings us back to the 3 cycles of 3 years. Because of these cycles, it was very easy for the priest to track the 3rd year tithe, or what is called in the Bible the year of tithing, by noting the phase of the moon when starting the sabbatical cycles. Here is where the ruler of the night and the ruler of the day work in concert. Deuteronomy 14, verse 28. And at the end of 3 years, even the same year, you shall bring forth all the tithe of your increase, and shall lay it up within your gates. Deuteronomy 26:12. When you have made an end of tithing, all the tithes of your increase, the 3rd year, the year of tithing, and you have given it to the Levite, the alien, the orphan, and the widow, that they may eat inside your gates and be filled. Now we have to remember how important the 6-year tithe was to sustain these poor people, the widows and the orphans and the poor, because there was not going to be any planting of the crops the next year. So now there's going to be several years before there's fresh crops to eat. So they have to make sure that everybody has provisions to make it through that sabbatical year. Yahuwah tells us that if we are following the correct sabbatical years, that he would provide the increase to see his people through the 3 years. Leviticus 25 verse 18. And you shall do my statutes, and you shall keep my judgments, and shall do them. And you shall live in the land securely. And the land shall give its fruits, and you shall eat to satisfaction, and you shall dwell securely on it. And when you say, what shall we eat in the 7th year? For lo, we may not sow, nor gather our increase. Then I have commanded my blessing on you in the 6th year, and it shall produce the increase for 3 years. And you shall sow the 8th year, and you shall eat the old crop until the 9th year. Until the coming of its crop, you shall eat of the old. Okay, so looking at our chart, we see 2015 where we started. We had a new moon. And so we're at the vernal equinox. It was a tetrad cycle, solar eclipse. There was a total solar eclipse on that day. I forgot to mention that. The total solar eclipse. So this was another reason why we kind of chose this year to start. It was just so many markers in the heavens. And think that possibly this might have even been a Jubilee year. So we're starting with the new moon. The moon is 0. It's at the 0 new moon stage. So this is what they would do. They'd start in their first year, and they would count. In 3 years, the moon would tell them that it is now 3 days old. This is the first 3rd year tithe. And in 3 more years, at the 6th year tithe, is now telling them that the moon is 6 days old. So then they would have a pause. They would have their sabbatical year. The 7th year would now come, and they would have no sowing, no gathering of the food. So we all know how that works, right? So after now, we are in the next year. So if we're looking at our chart, we can see we're here at 2022. That starts the next sabbatical cycle. One sabbatical cycle of 7 years is now complete. So if we started at 2015, the 7 years completes at 2022. And so we see here now that the moon is 18 days old. We're in a new sabbatical cycle. The moon is 18 days old. We count 3 years, and we see that the moon has advanced 3 days in age. It's now 21 days old. Then we go to the next 6th year tithe, and we see that it has advanced 4 days in age because we have a leap year. 4 days tells us there was a leap. That cycle still stays within the progression cycle. Thus, the next year is a sabbatical. They look at the moon phase for the sabbatical. It was 5 days old. In 3 years, it was 9 days old. Why was it 9 days old? Because we see it was a leap. And then the next 6th year tithe is now only 3 days older. It is 12 days old. So that is the 6th year tithe. The following year is the start of a new sabbatical cycle. So this is how they kept track of the 3rd year tithe, sabbatical, and jubilee years through the phases of the moon and this 3 year cycle that the moon has. These 3 cycles of 3 years. Like I said, a wheel inside a wheel inside a wheel. They're all intertwined, but each year is a part of its own 3-year cycle. Very easy for the priests to keep track of this very important moedium of our Father, the year of release. Baruch Hashem. Exodus 23, starting with verse 10. And you shall sow your land 6 years, and shall gather its produce. And the 7th year you shall let it rest, and let it alone. And the needy of your people shall eat. And what they leave, the animals of the field shall eat. So you shall do to your vineyard and your olive yard. This is the first mention of the sabbatical year. The 7th year, like the 7th day of the week, was sacred and therefore is to be a Sabbath rest. These verses contain precepts in which there is such significance. The ordinance seems to have been intended to teach dependence on providence and Yahuwah's faithfulness in sending a larger increase while we keep his appointments. Now remember, he tells us that the Sabbath day is the mark of his people. We could then apply that to his sabbatical and jubilee years as well. This directive is a reflection of the 4th commandment, where we are to rest our bodies and spirit every 7th day. Exodus 23:12, and you shall do no work 6 days, and on the 7th day you shall rest, so that your ox and your ass may rest, and the son of your slave girl and your alien may be refreshed. Not only are we not to do work on the Sabbaths of days, but we are to rest the land on the Sabbaths of years. We also have rest from our debt in the 7th year. Deuteronomy 15:1. Wouldn't that be great if we all followed Yahuwah's ordinances? And at the end of every 7 years, you shall make a release. We see this reflected in the 7 years Jacob offered to work for the hand of his beloved Rachel. After completing the 7 years, he was then released from his debt to make her his bride. Now, of course, we know that her father Laban fooled Jacob, giving him the older daughter Leah first. Thus, Jacob agreed to work another 7 years for Rachel. Genesis 29, starting with verse 18. And Jacob loved Rachel and said, I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. And Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they were in his eyes like a few days in his love for her. Aw. And Jacob said to Laban, give my wife, for my days are completed. It's the year of release. And let me go into her. Been waiting 7 years for this. And it happened in the morning, behold, she was Leah. And he said to Laban, what have you done to me? Did I not serve you for Rachel? And why have you tricked me? Verse 27, Laban says to him, fulfill the week, or the week of years, of this one, and we also give you this other one for the service which you will serve with me yet another 7 years. So now Laban is going to give Jacob a twofer. If he works another 7 years, he will get Rachel and her handmaid Bilhah. Deuteronomy 31:10. And Moses commanded them, saying, at the end of 7 years, in the appointed time, the year of release, in the Feast of Tabernacles. Verse 11. When all Israel comes in to see the face of Yahuwah in the place he chooses. See, that doesn't necessarily mean the temple. It's in the place where Yahuwah chooses. Not where man chooses, where Yahuwah chooses. And he tells you to go in the backyard and celebrate his feast. That's what you do. And you shall proclaim this law before all Israel in their ears. Leviticus 25:8. And you shall number to yourself 7 Sabbaths of years. 7 years times 7. And all the days of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be to you 49 years. Leviticus 25:10. And you shall make the 50th year holy, 1 year. All the other holy days were revealed to the Hebrews in the wilderness. Yet the exact time of the year of Jubilee was not revealed to Yahuwah's people until they crossed over the Jordan and entered the promised land. Leviticus 25:2. Speak to the sons of Israel, and you shall say to them, whenever you should enter into the land which I give you, then the land shall rest as a Sabbath to Yahuwah. So it wasn't until they actually owned land that they could give the land rest. So the year of Jubilee wasn't even given to them, wasn't even revealed to them until they entered the promised land, the land that was given to them. So once the Hebrews have crossed over the Jordan, they run into the city of Jericho. Now, Jericho is known as the city of palm trees or the year city. It is also known as the city of the moon or the crescent moon city. So putting both moon and year together, we have the lunar year. From the Jameson Fawcett Brown Bible commentary, we read about Jericho. It says, Jericho, some derive this name from the word signifying new moon in reference to the crescent-like plane in which it stood, formed by an amphitheater of hills. Unquote. Jericho is the crescent city, the moon city. In the Strong's Concordance, Jericho is defined as a lunation, and Urach, the moon. Now, because Jericho was a center for moon worship, the first thing Eloah had Israel do was to destroy the pagan moon worship system and at the same time reestablish his own priestly calendar and moedim of the Jubilees. Joshua 4 verse 13. About 40,000 prepared for war passed over before Eloah unto battle to the plains of Jericho. Joshua 6:2. And Eloah said unto Joshua, See, I have given unto thine hand Jericho, and the king thereof, and the mighty men of valor. Joshua 6:26. And Joshua charged them at that time, saying, Cursed before Eloah is the man who rises up and builds the city of Jericho. He shall lay the foundation of it in his firstborn, and in his youngest son he shall set up the gates of it. Yahuwah did not want us to reestablish this lunar system. The battle of Jericho is more about Yahuwah's creation calendar than it is about a conquest for Israel. A man is cursed before Eloah who rebuilds the system of following the moon. Think not? Let's look at the words. Builds. This word is banah. It means to repair or set up. City. Ayar. From the root word through the idea of opening the eyes awake, self, lift up self, raise up, stir up self. A primitive root meaning to be bare, be made naked, uncovered. Remember what we said earlier about the Rosh Chodesh being a feast that covers. Now Yahuwah is talking about being uncovered. Jericho, city of the moon, a lunation moon. So we're being told that cursed before Yahuwah is the man who repairs and rebuilds the system based on the moon that uncovers as this lifts up self. How does it lift up self? Because it takes man to determine by looking at the phases of the moon where it is. And it's arbitrary. Man goes out there and looks for the first day of the month by using the moon, and it's based on what you can see. Now, I've mentioned before, when we would go out to sight the moon, me living in the desert, we don't have a lot of pollution, and so when the atmospheric conditions were perfect, when they were great, we could see a 1% moon. Now, a fellow lunar observer 100 miles away may not have the same perfect atmospheric conditions, can only see the moon when it's at 3%. And many times, many months, it would be 3% before we could actually see it as well. So if I'm seeing it at 1% and my fellow brother 100 miles away is seeing it at 3% a day later, then who makes the decision on when the new month was? I mean, it's arbitrary for man, which is why it was instituted to begin with. Because once the lawful priests were ousted from the temple and the solar calendar was done away with, and they brought in, the new leaders brought in the old Babylonian lunar reckoning, this caused division in the group. So the priests, the Zadokites, left the temple because they could no longer observe feast days together because of this new lunar reckoning, which was actually the old Babylonian way. So this is where Yahuwah wants to put a stop to this lunar use, this wrongly using this lunar system for determining months and Sabbaths. I mean, we have gone through the scriptures. Nowhere are we instructed to use the moon in this manner. And if you don't understand how the moon works, then you're led to these false ideas. I mean, basically, the moon per scripture tells us that it's to rule the night. That's it. That's all scripture tells us, is that the moon is to rule the night. Well, in the physical world, we can see that she doesn't even do that all the time. If we don't understand how she works, then we can't understand how the Creator wanted us to use her in the division of his days. Many times when we read scripture, we get only the superficial understanding, but deeper meanings lie beneath the surface. It is like opening one door to find another. Each time the scripture is read, another meaning or door appears as we dig down through the layers. So let's read Isaiah to find a key to a deeper understanding, as it reveals there is a year of mercy that will open the prison and allow the captives to go free. Isaiah 61 verse 1. The Spirit of Sovereign Yahuwah is upon me. Eloah hath anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and to open the prison of them that are bound. Verse 2, to proclaim Eloh's year of pardon, his year of mercy, to proclaim the acceptable year. This is the year that satisfies a debt of Yahuwah, the acceptable year of Yahuwah, and the day of vengeance of our Eloah, to comfort all that mourn. This year of pardon is also known as the year of Jubilee, the year of release, which was not revealed to Israel until they crossed over the Jordan River. So the word Jordan is from the Persian word yar, meaning year, and Dan, meaning river. Thus it is the year river. It can also be interpreted as the year of Dan, that is the year of judgment. It is the river of death, the river of judgment. Joshua 3:14. The people set out from their tents to cross over the Jordan with the priests in front, carrying the Ark of the Covenant. Now the Jordan floods over all of its banks throughout the time of harvest. But as soon as the priests reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water at the edge, we read Joshua 3:16, and the water flowing down from upstream was brought to a standstill, rising up in the single mass for a very great distance indeed. In Adam, a city in the direction of Zaratan. Interesting that Zaratan means pierced or punctured, while those flowing downstream toward the salt sea of the Arabah, of the wilderness, disappeared entirely. Thus the people crossed over opposite Jericho. Joshua 3:17. While all Israel were crossing over on dry ground, the priest who bore the Ark of the Covenant of Eloah stood on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan until the entire nation finished crossing over the Jordan. When Israel crosses over the Jordan into the promised land, the moon city of Jericho, the false lunar year must fall, as it is an obstacle at the entrance into the land. Joshua 6, starting with verse 3. Thus you must compass the city, all you men of war, and go around the city once. Thus shall you do 6 days. And 7 priests must bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. But the 7th day you must compass the city 7 times, and the priests will blow the shofars. Verse 8. And it came to pass, when Joshua had spoken unto the people, that the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns passed on before Eloah, and blew the ram's horns, and the ark of the covenant of Yahuwah followed them. The 7 trumpets of ram's horns are duplicated in the 7 trumps of Revelation. Before the kingdom of peace descends upon the earth must be cleansed with judgment, which the 7 trumpets denote. The 1,000-year reign of HaMashiach liberates the earth and is preceded by blowing of the 7 shofars. The invisible becoming visible, as foreseen through the shadow of the year of liberation in the final 7th year, the year of Jubilee. When the day of wrath comes upon the earth, the ram's horn will sound to warn the people. Ezekiel 33, 3 and 4. If when he sees the sword come upon the land, he blows the shofar and warns the people, then whatsoever hears the sound of the shofar and heeds not the warning, then the sword comes and takes him away. His blood will be upon his own head, instead upon the head of HaMashiach. Israel marched around Jericho for 7 days, once every day for 6 days, but on the 7th they marched around Jericho 7 times. 7 plus 6 is a total of 13 circuits around Jericho. As mentioned before, the moon orbits the earth 13 times in a solar year. This number 13 is brought forth in Revelation with the 7 trumpets and 7 vials poured out on the earth. The 7th trumpet consists of the 7 vials. Thus, 6 trumpets plus 7 vials of the 7th trumpet bring forth again a total of 13. Ever wonder why the number 13 is considered bad luck? Again, Hallel, perverting the things that are sacred to Eloah. Sadly, Israel failed to fulfill the sabbatical and jubilee year requirement almost from the very beginning. Jeremiah 34, starting with verse 14. At the end of 7 years, each man should let go his brother, who is a Hebrew, who has been sold to him. When he has served you 6 years, you shall let him go free from you. But your fathers did not listen to me, nor stretch out their ear. And you had turned today, and you did right in my eyes, to call for liberty, each man to his neighbor. And you cut a covenant before me in the house on which is called my name. But you turned and profaned my name. And each man caused his male slave, and each man his female slave, to return whom you had sent away according to their desire. And you subjected them to be slaves and female slaves to you. On account of this, thus says Yahuwah, you hearken not to me to a release, each for his brother, and each for his neighbor. Behold, I call a release to you, to the sword, that's war, and to the plague, and to the famine, and I will give you for dispersion unto all the kingdoms of the earth. The curses for not keeping the sabbatical year bring famine, disease, destruction, disaster, and death. Leviticus 26, starting with verse 27. If you will not listen to me for this, and shall walk contrary to me, then I also will walk contrary to you in fury. I also will chastise you, I also 7 times your sin. And you shall not eat of the flesh of your sons, and you shall not eat of the flesh of your daughters. And I shall destroy your high places, and cut down your altars, and put your dead bodies on the carcasses of your idols. And my soul shall loathe you. And I shall make your cities a waste, and I shall make your sanctuaries desolate, and I shall not smell your sweet fragrances. And I shall make the land desolate, and your enemies who are living in it shall be astonished at it all. And I will scatter you among nations, and will draw out the sword after you. And your land shall become a waste, and your cities shall be desolation. Verse 34. Then the land shall enjoy its Sabbaths all the days of the desolation, and you shall be in the land of your enemies. Then the land shall enjoy rest, and shall enjoy its Sabbaths. Israel failed to enter into Yahweh's Sabbath because of disobedience and lack of faith. Hebrews 3, starting with verse 16. Who were they who heard and rebelled? Were they not those Moses led out of Egypt, and with whom he was angry for 40 years? The ecclesia has now wandered for 40 jubilees. Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? To whom was Yahuwah speaking when he took a vow that they would never enter his Sabbath? Wasn't it the people who disobeyed him? So we see that they were not able to enter Yahweh's Sabbath because of the lack of trust. Psalms 95:6. Come, let us bow down in worship. Let us kneel before Yahweh our Maker. For he is our Eloah. We are the people he watches over, the flock under his care. If only you would listen to his voice today. Yahweh says, don't harden your hearts as Israel did in Meribah, the place of quarreling and complaining, at the time of testing in the wilderness part of the word. For there your ancestors tested and tried my patience, even though they saw everything I did. For 40 years I was loathed and cut off by this revolution of time. Thus I said, this is a people who go astray in their heart. They do not approve, acknowledge, or understand my ways. They refuse to follow my instructions. So my wrath, I swore a 7 times vow. They will never enter my Sabbath, my place of rest. Wow. Considering that his Sabbath is his mark, that is strong word indeed. Those who entered the promised land under Joshua entered a rest that was but a shadow of the true Sabbath rest that is only received in Yahshua HaMashiach, which is also explained in Hebrews. Hebrews 4, starting with verse 7. He again marks out a certain day, saying in David, today, after so long a time, according as he has said, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given Israel Sabbath rest, Yahweh would not have spoken later about another day. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of Yahweh. Anyone who enters Yahweh's Sabbath also rests from his own work. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that Sabbath rest, so that no one will fall by following Israel's example of disobedience. For the word of Yahweh is alive and powerful. It is sharper than the sharpest two-edged sword, cutting between soul and spirit, between joint and marrow. It exposes and judges our innermost thoughts, attitudes, and intentions of the heart. Verse 13. Nothing in all creation is hidden from Yahweh's sight. All things are uncovered and laid naked before the eyes of him to whom we must render an account. We now possess the key of knowledge in understanding the importance of the sabbatical and jubilee years to our Creator, and the punishments and curses that befall us when we fail to observe these sacred times. We would then believe that our Creator left no way for us to find the Sabbaths of years when so much is at stake. I encourage you to study the courses of the moon and understand that lunar and solar must work together within a compatible system in order to divide our Creator's days correctly. And now that we know how the sabbatical and jubilees are counted, we are one step closer to learning exactly where we are in the jubilee cycle according to the Creator's timepiece. Isaiah 40, verse 26. Lift up your eyes on high. Look up and behold. See who has created these things, that brings out their host by number. He called them all by names, by the greatness of his might. Baruch Hashem. Praise Yahweh. This is where we are going to have to conclude our study for today. with the lesser light, the moon, and make part 3 for the lesser light, the stars. I hope you have come away with a better key of understanding Yahuwah's division of days and the importance of not only understanding how the lights work in the physical, but how our Creator intended for us to use them. All praise and glory to Him, the Most High. And as always, if you have questions, feel free to email us at remnantofthelight@gmail.com and check out our website where you can find more in-depth studies on these subjects at remnantofthelight.net. Thank you again for joining me. And until we meet again, I'm going to wish you Shalom. Shalom.
Shalom, shalom.